in the coastal town of Menton, where the Mediterranean meets the French Riviera in an eternal embrace of blue and gold, there lived an old ballerina whose stories carried the weight of waves and the whisper of ancient secrets. Her apartment overlooked the sea from its perch above La Mer's ballet school, and every morning she would sit on her weathered veranda with a china teacup, watching the sun paint silver paths across the water. The children would gather around her chair like flowers turning toward light, drawn by something indefinable in her presence, a quality that spoke of depths beyond their understanding, of mysteries that lived in the space between dream and waking. Alice, her granddaughter, was the tallest among them, nearly old enough to outgrow such stories, yet she remained, curled against her grandmother's side like a cat seeking warmth. "Tell us about the woman from the ocean," the children would plead, their voices mingling with the distant sound of waves against the shore and the gentle patter of rain that seemed to fall so often in this place where sea met sky. The old ballerina would set down her teacup with practiced grace, her weathered hands still carrying the elegant precision that had once made audiences weep in theaters across Europe. Around her wrist, she wore a peculiar bracelet, seaweed encased in glass, green as deep water, mysterious as the stories she told. "They say the woman came from the ocean when she was still young," she would begin, her voice carrying the cadence of waves, the rhythm of rain on window panes. "And they said that she came of her own free will, driven by curiosity and the restless heart of youth." The children would settle deeper into their listening, while above them the rain fell in gentle sheets, creating a curtain of sound that seemed to separate their small gathering from the rest of the world. It was the kind of rain that spoke of comfort and shelter, the kind that made indoor spaces feel sacred and stories feel more real than the everyday world beyond. But they also said, the ballerina continued, her eyes growing distant as they always did when she reached this part of the tale, that years later, when she tried to return to her ocean home, she could not. The passage that had opened for her once in the violet light of a special moon had closed, and so she spent years by the shore, night after night, begging the ocean to take her back. Alice knew this story by heart, yet she never tired of hearing it. There was something in her grandmother's voice when she told it, something that suggested the tale was more than mere fiction, more than the fairy stories that other grandmothers might tell. This story lived in the old woman's bones, in the careful way she held her teacup, in the distant look that came into her eyes when she gazed out at the endless blue of the Mediterranean. By the time the water stilled like a lake and the moon shone violet again, as it had the night she first left, the ballerina would say, her voice growing softer as the rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof above. She was but an old woman, old and with a family now, with a life full of other lives. She took her coffee on the veranda and wept at night, and read her books, dreaming of the ocean with no hope of return. The story always ended there for the children, but Alice had heard the longer version, whispered on nights when the rain fell harder and the ocean sang louder against the shore. She knew there was more to tell, more layers to unfold, like the petals of some exotic flower that bloomed only in the deepest parts of the sea. When the other children would eventually grow restless and wander away to play their games of pretend sirens and underwater kingdoms, Alice would remain. It was then that her grandmother would speak more freely, sharing fragments of a larger story that seemed to encompass not just the woman from the ocean, but the very essence of longing itself. This story is not about whether it is true or who the woman is, the old ballerina would say, shifting her still limber body into a more comfortable position. Even in her advanced years, she moved with a dancer's grace, each gesture deliberate and beautiful. It is about the woman finding her way back home, whether the ocean will ever offer itself up again, and when it does, if the woman will be ready to accept the offer. Alice would lift her head from her grandmother's elbow during these philosophical interludes, processing the complex web of possibility and regret that seemed to live at the heart of every story worth telling. The rain would continue its gentle symphony above them, and the smell of salt air would mingle with the earthier scent of rain-washed stone and blooming jasmine from the gardens below. "But who is the woman, Grandmère?" Alice would ask, though she asked this question every time, and though she suspected she already knew the answer in the deepest part of her heart. The ballerina would close her eyes as if in pain, though Alice's question came like clockwork, predictable as the tides. "My love, that does not matter. Go and play on the ocean. Ask her, beg her, give the woman her gift. Let the woman home." But Alice was old enough now to see through such deflections, old enough to recognize the particular quality of sorrow that lived in her grandmother's voice. She believed, with the certainty that comes to children who grow up surrounded by mysteries, that the ballerina was the woman from the ocean. And she would not have been wrong, at least not entirely. The truth, as these things often are, was more complex than any simple identification could capture. The ballerina had indeed been the woman in the years between the first opening of the way, when she was 16 and full of the restless energy that drives the young to impossible choices, and the second opening, when she was 73 and had lived a lifetime on land, accumulating loves and losses like shells gathered on a long walk down the beach. But she was also aware, with the painful clarity that comes with age and experience, that the second opening had not been an opening at all, but a closing. She had known, looking out through tear-filled eyes at a silent violet sea on that night so many years ago, that there would be no lost love climbing out of the waves to hold her and tell her the ocean still forgave her choice. She had made her decision, and decisions once made have a way of becoming permanent in ways that the young can never truly understand. Yet knowing this, understanding the finality of her situation with the cruel clarity that age bestows, she had still walked to the edge of the waves on that violet night. She had still swum out to the sandbar when her aging body allowed it, had still rested in the buoyant embrace of salt water, and sobbed for her mother to take her back, to forgive her, to somehow undo the irreversible passage of time and choice. It was in those moments, floating in the familiar embrace of the sea, that she became young again. The weight of years would fall away like shed clothing, and she would remember herself as she had been, 16 and fierce, and so certain that the world beyond the waves held adventures worth any sacrifice. She would remember standing outside La Mer's ballet school for the first time, feeling naked without the push and pull of the waves that had been her constant companions since birth. She had watched the girls through the tall windows, these land-bound creatures in their stiff shoes and flowing white costumes, moving to music that seemed to come from their very hearts. They danced with a grace that reminded her of kelp swaying in deep currents, with a strength that echoed the relentless power of the tides. She had wanted, with a hunger that surprised her, to be like them, to dance with grace and strength, to move like the ocean but on dry land, in the bright world of human music and human love. The secretary who first saw her had taken in her appearance with poorly concealed disapproval. The tattered clothing stolen from the back of a cafe, the seaweed bracelets that marked her as something other than entirely human, the desperate expression of someone who had bet everything on a single impossible hope. But the instructor, Cedric, had watched her dance, had seen her limbs made strong by swimming against currents, graceful from years of moving through water, yet somehow purposeless, like a song without words or a poem without meter. "Do you have a place to stay, madam?" he had asked, and something in his voice, a kindness that expected no return, a gentleness that spoke of understanding deeper than mere sympathy, had made her brave enough to tell the truth. "My home is—" "No, I don't," she had said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. How could she explain that her home was everywhere and nowhere, that it moved with the tides and changed with the phases of the moon? "We have a boarding school program within the ballet school," Cedric had told her, his voice carrying the same measured cadence that the rain now made against the windows of her apartment so many years later. "For highly talented, highly motivated individuals. Are you one of those?" She had closed her eyes then, trying to hear the ocean from where she stood, but finding only silence. The movements of dance, those graceful girls in white clothing and impossible shoes, were as close to the ocean as she had felt in the weeks since her failed attempt to return home. If the ocean would not take her back, then perhaps this strange ritual of moving the body to music could be a substitute, a way of carrying the sea with her into this dry, bright world of human ambition and human art. When she opened her eyes again, she found Cedric watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was small and quiet, but clearly in complete control of his movements, possessed of a grace she had only seen in the oldest and wisest of her kind. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Her eyes, she knew, were striking. Darkest indigo like the deepest trenches of the ocean, holding storms and stillness in equal measure. But his eyes were different. Emerald like the water above a sandbar, speaking of peace and safety, and the kind of home that didn't shift with the tides. She had nodded in answer to his question, though she wasn't entirely sure what highly motivated meant in the context of this strange land world. What she was motivated by was survival, by the need to find some purpose now that her first choice had been taken from her. But perhaps that was motivation enough. When he asked her name, she found herself at a loss. The name given to her by the ocean could only be heard by the wildest of waves, understood by the creatures that lived in the deepest places, spoken by her own kind in the language of current and tide. It was not a name that could be pronounced by human tongues, or written in human letters. Her eyes fell on a small brown container on the secretary's desk, where a white and purple blossom had been placed as decoration. She pointed to it, letting the tip of her thumb touch the delicate petals. "This," she said, not daring to look at him directly. "The peony?" he asked, following her gesture. "Or do you mean the violet color?" The word violet resonated in her chest like a struck bell. It carried the sound of the sea at twilight, when the sky and water become indistinguishable and the world holds its breath between day and night. "Yes," she said. "My name is Violet." "Violet," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like music, like poetry, like something precious and rare. He took her hand then, and his touch was warm and dry and completely unlike anything she had ever experienced. "My name is Cedric. Good to meet you." "Cedric," she said, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "One who is loved." His eyebrows rose in surprise, and his smile deepened. "Yes, that's what it means. I thought only I knew that." "Where I come from," Violet told him, and even as she spoke she could feel herself committing to this new identity, this land-based version of herself. The meaning of names is almost more important than the sound of the name itself. "You have a beautiful name." "Thank you," he said, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, or the first stirring of something that would grow into love given time and attention, and the careful tending that the best human emotions require. She thought back to this encounter often in the years that followed, treasuring it like a small mottled pearl kept safe in her deepest pockets. It became one of her touchstones, a memory she could return to in her darkest and loneliest moments, proof that she had been capable of new beginnings, that transformation was possible, even for someone like her. After a few weeks at the school, she stood out as a natural talent, though not in the way that the other students were naturals. Where they had technique and ambition, she had something deeper, a connection to movement itself, to the fundamental rhythms that underlie all graceful motion. She danced not like someone who had learned steps, but like someone who had learned to embody the very essence of flowing motion. Cedric, in his wisdom, taught her only the basics before passing her on to Monique, a very old woman who danced better than any young person had a right to expect. She was the second teacher in the school's triumvirate. Cedric, Monique, and Claudia, a woman with bleached hair and a smile that could charm kings and commoners alike. Back straight, arm higher, fingers outstretched, Monique would command, her voice cutting through the sound of rain on the studio's tall windows. It is as if you are grasping for something you cannot reach. Do it. Again. Again. Violet practiced the motions again and again, Monique's voice ringing in her ears with each attempt. It was Monique who introduced her to the harder edges of the dance world, the cigarettes and the jockey's diet of lettuce and stimulants that kept dancers thin and sharp and always reaching for perfection. But it was also Monique who gave her the gift of music, real music, the compositions of Liszt and Chopin, and the great Russian ballets that could make audiences weep with their beauty. From Monique, she learned discipline, how to channel passion and grace into precise, repeatable movements. She learned to dance late into the night and wake early, to begin moving as soon as her sleep-blurred eyes could focus on the mirror. She learned that excellence required sacrifice, that art demanded everything, and gave back only what you were strong enough to take. The highest compliment Monique ever paid her came after months of grinding work, on a night when the rain fell so hard it sounded like applause against the studio windows. "They say I dance better than all young women," the old teacher said, watching Violet complete a sequence that had taken weeks to master. This is no longer true. 4 years passed like this, thousands and millions of tides rising and falling beyond the windows, thousands and millions of tears shed in the pursuit of an impossible perfection. She saw little of Cedric during this time, their interaction limited to those first weeks when he had taught her the basic positions, the fundamental grammar of this new language she was learning to speak with her body. But on a windy May morning, when the rain fell in gentle sheets and the air smelled of salt and blooming flowers, he knocked on the door of her small boarding room as she was stretching for the day. When she opened the door, light from the hallway spilled into her space, weaving around both of them and forming patterns on the floor like choreography made of illumination itself. Her room was simple, but had become truly hers over the 4 years. The window on the far wall was open, letting in the white morning sun and the cotton curtains that danced in the sea wind. A white metal bed frame supported a mattress that had molded itself to her sleeping form, covered with violet blankets that reminded her of twilight over water. In one corner sat her small record player and a collection of classical music: Tchaikovsky, Pärt, and Palestrina. On the window seat, her growing library, History of France, Dickens, Camus, and Brecht. And beside them, her notebook filled with sketches of the ocean as she remembered it, as she dreamed it still. Cedric stood in her doorway, looking as though someone had transported him there by magic and commanded him to speak, though he had no idea what to say. He held something in his hands, and Violet found herself hoping it was flowers, something to brighten the room, while simultaneously hoping it was not flowers, which seemed too ordinary for whatever was happening between them. When he held out his gift, she was forced to look away from his eyes. It was a book, The Call of the Sirens and Other Myths. She looked at it, then back at him, and felt something warm and golden spread through her chest. "For you," he said, his words tumbling over each other in his nervousness. "But I also came to ask you to come to the beach with me. Not that this is bribing you to come. You can always say no, but I thought it would be nice to just walk there. But it's okay, not an issue." He began to turn away, still clutching the book, and Violet felt panic rise in her throat. This moment felt important in ways she couldn't articulate, like a tide turning or a storm passing. "No, wait. Cedric, come back," she called, remembering advice Claudia had given her about such moments. He turned, tripped, caught himself, and nearly threw himself back toward her doorway. Yes, yes. She looked at him, his earnest face, the golden hair that caught the morning light, his emerald eyes now wide with hope and embarrassment, and felt something shift inside her chest, something like recognition or homecoming. "I'll go to the beach with you, Cedric," she said, and for reasons she couldn't explain, though she knew he was about the same height as her, perhaps taller, she felt as though she were looking down at him from a great height. He noticed, too. "You're tall." Violet laughed, taking the book from his hands and tossing it onto her bed before following him into the hallway. "I'm happy. I suppose that's why." As they walked through the corridors of the school and out into the cloudy morning, he spoke about the book, about how he had noticed her love for the ocean and thought she might enjoy reading about selkies and sirens and other creatures of myth and legend. "Do you believe in them?" she asked, tucking her arm into his as they made their way toward the sound of waves. The question felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. His eyes smiled up at her, green as sea foam, warm as summer water. "Are you one of them?" "I don't think so," she said, though even as she spoke she knew it wasn't entirely true. From here she could see and smell the ocean, and the familiar scent of salt water wrapped around her like an embrace she had almost forgotten she was missing. "I sort of wondered where you came from, Violet," he said as they walked. "When you walked into Lemaire's, what was it, 4 years ago?" The moment had come, she realized, when she would have to choose between the safety of lies and the dangerous territory of truth. She had grown to love Cedric over these years, not just for who he was, but for who he wanted to be, for the dreams he carried and the gentleness he brought to everything he touched. She wanted him to love her too, which meant she wanted him to love all of her, even the parts that didn't make sense in his world. "From the ocean," she said carefully, watching his face for signs of disbelief or dismissal. "I walked out of the ocean 4 years ago, a few weeks before I came to the school. I was young and headstrong and was sick of my mother, the ocean, and my family. I wanted a day away, a day of sights and sounds, and perhaps I'd magically find love on land too." She desperately wanted to look at him, to gauge his reaction, but fear kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Her stomach had gone cold with the terror of rejection, of being seen as mad or foolish or something other than human. "I went back that night," she continued, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain beginning to fall more steadily. "Alone in the darkness, wading into the waves. I thought I would feel my particular love for the water, the waves to pull me along, and my mother to welcome me back. But I had forgotten that the water had been as still as a lake when I left, and the moon was violet." Here she forced herself to look at him, to see what her truth had done to his perception of her. "This is where your name came from, then," was all he said, his eyes still warm, still kind. They were approaching the cliffs near the beach entrance, and she felt herself beginning to shrink with sorrow and the weight of memory. Yes, my true name, explained in long words, signifies the dance that the sand makes at the floor of the ocean. She spoke it then, in her original language, a sound like waves retreating over pebbles. But when I made my choice to leave, it was leaving forever, if I had known that. Why ballet, then? Cedric asked, as they stopped atop the rugged black cliff, standing arm in arm so close that their shoulders touched and warmed each other despite the cooling rain. It was as close to the movement of the waves as I could find, she said simply. He looked at her then, and she realized that during the telling of her story, she had indeed grown shorter, was now several inches below his eye level. "Look at that," he said, beginning to smile. "You're shorter." She laughed, the sound mixing with the rain and the distant crash of waves. When the ocean is happy, she rises. So do we. "I'm glad you left," he said then, his words cutting through her fear like light through water. "I grieve for you, all the beauty you had to leave behind, but I'm glad you're here with me." The warmth that spread through her chest at these words was like nothing she had ever experienced. Not the familiar embrace of salt water, not the satisfaction of a perfectly executed movement, but something entirely new and entirely human. "You believe me," she said, wonder coloring her voice. He looked out at the ocean, stirring and sighing as the wind moved across its surface and the rain dimpled its waves. "I'm no legalist," he said. "I read too many fantasies and Greek myths as a boy. I've been in love with the sea for decades. I suppose I'll have to settle for one of her daughters." Violet laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling for the first time since leaving the ocean that she might have found another kind of home. "I think I'm in love with you," she said. The years that followed were filled with a happiness she had never imagined possible. She and Cedric were married on the cliffs overlooking the sea, with Monique and Claudia as witnesses, and the sound of waves providing music for their vows. She became not just a student at Le Maire's, but eventually its co-director, and later, after Cedric's death from illness when they were both still young enough to believe they had forever, its sole owner. She had children, not born in the traditional way, but gathered like shells along the beach. Students who came to her with nowhere else to go, with stories of their own that didn't fit the normal patterns of human life. Alice was the latest of these. Her granddaughter, not by blood but by choice, by love, by the bonds that form when one lost soul recognizes another. Now, as an old woman taking her coffee on the veranda while rain fell like music on the roof above, she would hold her memories like mottled pearls, examining them in the light of her accumulated years. The view from what had once been Monique's room, and was now hers, encompassed all 3 points where the ocean met the horizon, left and right where water touched land, and straight ahead where it stretched toward the sun and infinity. It was at times like these, with Alice tucked against her side and the other children dreaming of swimming to the sandbar to play at being sirens, that she wondered if Cedric had been right when he told her on their wedding day, "You have 2 homes now." Had that been true? Had she successfully built a life that honored both the ocean that bore her and the land that had claimed her? Or had she simply been in exile all these years, making the best of circumstances beyond her control? "My love," she would tell Alice when the story ended and the rain continued its gentle percussion above them. "Take my cup to the kitchen and wash it for me. Then let me see you swim to the sandbar with the others before warm-up today. There is a certain gentleman coming from Paris today to look at our best students." Alice would smile at her with eyes that held depths beyond her years. "Grandmère," she would say, "I will swim out there to please you. But I don't want to go to Russia. I want to stay here and dance like the ocean." Dance like the ocean on all the stages of the world, Violet would tell her, though the words cost her more than she could ever admit. She didn't want Alice to leave. Alice was part of what made Menton feel like home, part of what anchored her to this life she had built on land. But she also knew that Alice would leave, as the young must, as she herself had done so many years ago. Alice would dance like the ocean and bring tears to the eyes of Russian diplomats and audiences in theaters across the world. And she was right. When Alice left with the man from Paris, after many tears and kisses and promises to write letters, Violet felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had been broken and mended many times over the years, but something deeper. The last thread that connected her to the future, perhaps, or the final reason to remain on land when the ocean called. That night, she walked down the creaky steps of the school for the last time, down to the shore where she had married Cedric on the cliffs so many years ago. The rain had stopped, and the moon hung full and violet in the clear sky, just as it had on the night she first left the ocean, just as it had on the night she tried to return. She entered the waves as she had countless times before, but this time was different. This time, she swam toward the sun until she had no strength left, until her aged body could carry her no further from the shore. She expected to sink, expected the ocean to claim her at last, not in love, but in the simple mathematics of exhaustion and salt water. Instead, she felt the familiar arms wrap around her, felt herself lifted and cradled as she had been as a child. The ocean took Violet in her embrace at last, not as punishment or prize, but as what she had always been. A daughter coming home after a long journey, carrying with her all the treasures and wisdom she had gathered in the bright world above the waves. The rain began to fall again as she disappeared beneath the surface, gentle and warm, like tears of joy, like the sound of applause, like the music that plays when every story finds its way to the only ending that was ever possible. Love welcoming love. Home embracing the one who had never really left. The eternal dance of departure and return that governs all things beneath the vast, unknowable sky. And in the morning, when the children came looking for their story, they found only an empty chair on the veranda, a china teacup washed clean and waiting for hands that would never hold it again, and the sound of waves against the shore that seemed to carry, for those who knew how to listen, the echo of ancient stories, and the promise that some journeys end exactly where they began.